Hello everybody, Anna again, 6th year Home Economics. We're beginning our unit on food commodities, and the first food we're going to start with is meat. So there are certain headings we have to cover for each of these food commodities. The first one with meat is the classification. So classification means groups. We can divide our classification of meat into 4 groups. We have carcass meat. So this is where the meat comes off the bones of the animal, and this includes pork, beef and lamb. Poultry are birds that are domestically reared for human consumption, so that will include chicken, turkey, goose and duck, primarily. There are some exceptions to that. And then game, these are birds that are shot for sport, so that will include things like mallard, and small game birds like snipe. Often with these birds you have to be particularly careful cooking them and eating them, because you can get bits of the shot that was used to hunt them, and it's very unpleasant to eat. Offal are the edible internal organs of animals, so these would include things like liver, kidney, sweetbreads, which are the lymph glands, brains. We don't commonly eat that here, it was very popular in France. So that's our classification of meat. Now we're looking at the nutritive value. So meat contains protein. Depending on the type of meat, it's between 17 and 23% protein. It's high biological value protein. So this tells us that it contains all the essential amino acids in the correct proportions for the needs of the body. And the particular proteins that it contains, and I'm afraid to tell you do need to know the names of these, spelling mistake there, myosin, actin and globulin in the meat fibres, and collagen, elastin in the connective tissue. And when we come to look at the diagram, I'll explain those in a bit more detail. The fat in meat is saturated fat. The percentage varies depending on the type of meat we're talking about. So for example, our carcass meat up here, beef would be the lowest, pork would be next, slightly higher percentage of fat than beef, and lamb would be the fattiest of the 3. And if you remember back when we talked about preservation, we talked about the fact that lamb and pork can't be kept in your freezer for as long as beef because of the risk of hydrolytic rancidity from the fat content. Also keep in mind when you're talking about fat, our current healthy eating guidelines, which are to increase polyunsaturated fat and reduce saturated fat. And with our protein advice for our healthy eating guidelines is that half our protein should be plant-based and half animal-based. Like all the protein food commodities, meat contains no carbohydrate, so you need to serve that with the carbohydrate. And if you're asked to give an example, that should be a whole grain carbohydrate, so it should be something like potatoes, brown rice or brown pasta. The mineral content of meat, they contain B vitamins, B1, B2, B3, B6. B12, when we were talking about the minerals, remember who that's important for: vegans. The only source of B12 are animal products, so vegans need to take a supplement of that. Also be mindful, depending on the method of cooking you choose, that B vitamins are fairly unstable and can be destroyed fairly easily. Offal contain additional vitamins A, D and K. The minerals in meat, heme iron, and if you remember we talked about iron, we said that heme iron is much easier for the body to absorb. And if you're taking non-heme iron from plant sources, your body finds that a little bit more difficult to process and to use. It also contains the minerals zinc and sulfur and potassium and phosphorus. We don't worry too much about potassium and phosphorus because they're contained in so many foods that we eat. Our next heading is dietetic value. The dietetic value is how useful is this food as part of your daily diet. And if you refer to your notes, you'll see on the first page for meat that the dietetic value for adult children, adolescents and pregnant women, the HBV is needed for growth and repair. For convalescents, that's somebody recovering from illness, it's needed for the repair of cells. For teenagers, particularly teenage girls, it's a very important source of heme iron. Remember also you need vitamin C to absorb iron, so meat should be served ideally with a salad because the vitamin C is so unstable when you cook it. For those who are low calorie diets or have heart disease or high cholesterol, they need to restrict their intake of meat and they need to be very careful to choose lean meat. So moving on to looking at the buying and storing of meat. So we're looking at purchasing, storing and preparing. And a lot of this overlaps what we looked at in our unit on food safety and hygiene. So things like buying from a reputable retailer who implements strict hygiene practices, particularly with meat, that they don't handle the money and the meat. Somebody else should be taking your money, or they should take off their gloves if they have to handle money. You need to trust the temperatures in their fridges. I'll come later to look at the supply chain. We call it traceability from farm to fork with meat, and Board Bia have implemented steps to ensure that that happens. If you're buying it in a supermarket, always check the use-by date. Buy at the end of your shopping to avoid it sitting in your trolley for too long. Remember from our study of microbiology that microorganisms favour, particularly bacteria, favour high protein, damp foods. Meat is one of these foods. Ensure that raw and cooked foods are stored separately wherever you buy your meat. Make sure it has, when I say a pleasant smell, it shouldn't have any smell, slight sourness to the smell. That's telling us there are bacteria growing and multiplying. And it should be the right colour for the meat. You know, beef should be a good deep red, pork should be a pale pinkish colour. So storing. Right, storing again, this is recapping a lot of what we would have looked at with HACCP and with food safety. Refrigerate immediately, bottom shelf of the fridge, loosely wrapped. We don't want any meat juice dripping down onto other foods and cross-contaminating other foods we keep in the fridge. So if you buy it loose from a butcher, put it on a plate, loosely wrap it. If it's pre-packaged when you buy the meat, for example, if it's vacuum packed, look at the use-by date and make sure you don't exceed that. Once you unwrap vacuum packed foods, you have to use it like fresh. So 2 to 3 days is the most you should keep meat in your fridge. If it's mince, you should use it the day you buy it, at the very latest the next day. If you're planning to freeze meat, and that's often a good idea, you know, meat's an expensive food to buy. If you see a special offer, buy one get one free or 2 for 3, buy it, bring it home, follow the guidelines we looked at for freezing and label it clearly. So preparing. I explained extensively to you in the past about thawing out poultry, how to do that, how to check that it's thoroughly thawed. Always wash your hands before you handle meat. Good personal hygiene. You prepare it on a red board. At home we wouldn't always have colour coordinated boards, so prepare it on a board and then wash that board out with warm soapy water and use a different knife and a different board to prepare other ingredients. If you're roasting meat, make sure your oven is fully preheated. You have to make sure the food is cooked all the way through to the centre. We discussed the details on how to do that with poultry. With meat, calculate the cooking time according to the table in your cookery book. You have some of those timings already for chicken, and if you have a digital probe or a meat thermometer, you can test if it's cooked by checking that it's over 74 degrees all the way through to the centre. I'll come to the choice of cooking method in a minute when we look at what factors influence the toughness or tenderness of meat. If you have leftover meat, cool it as quickly as possible, cover and store in the fridge on a separate shelf from your raw meat. Okay, so the next heading is the effects of cooking on meat. So, what happens to meat when we cook it? Well, first of all, bacteria are destroyed. This is making our meat safe to eat, and as we discussed before, if you like your steak blood red in the middle, that's absolutely fine. Food poisoning bacteria can only survive on the surface of meat. It's too dense for them to penetrate the fibres. So once the meat is browned on the outside, it's perfectly safe to eat. That does not apply to mince, where you've mixed the outside of the meat in with the centre of the meat. Burgers and anything made with minced meat should be cooked all the way through. We've had the conversation before about outlets in Dublin that ask how you would like your burger cooked. From a food safety point of view, anything other than cooked all the way through for burgers is not acceptable. So the second thing that happens is the protein coagulates. So that's we see that immediately as we see the colour changing from red to brown, and what's happening is the protein is coagulating and setting and sealing the outside of our meat. The colour changes from red to brown. That is actually the protein myosin changes colour. We get some loss of B vitamins because they're not stable to heat. Now the collagen, which is part of the connective tissue, changes to gelatin, and that's what makes the meat soft to eat. If you overcook your meat, you're going to make it very indigestible and tough. And the protein begins to coagulate somewhere between 40 and 50 degrees centigrade. So you see that pretty quickly. A good example is a steak on a pan, your hot pan, and you'll see the coagulation and the changing of colour pretty instantly. Okay, so this brings us to the structure of meat. And you can see I have two diagrams here. If you look very closely at meat, you can see a grain in the meat, a bit like the grain in the wood. And you will see that meat is made up of bundles of meat fibres. We have two types of fat on meat. We have what is called visible fat. So that's like the fat at the edge of a steak or at the edge of a chop. And then we have what's called marbling. And this is our marbling. This is where you have bits of fat spread throughout the meat fibres. And this is one of the things that gives meat its flavour when it's cooked, is the melting of the marbled fat. So are anybody concerned about the amount of saturated fat they're taking in, or people like me who don't like eating fat? You can cut off as much of the visible fat as you can see, but you will not be able to remove the marbling. Now, the meat fibres are made up of connective tissue. Now you will see in this diagram I've done short fibres with thin connective tissue. This diagram here has much longer fibres with much thicker connective tissue. So the goal when you're cooking meat is to choose a cooking method that will turn, like we said here, the connective tissue, the collagen, into gelatin, because gelatin is soft. So if you imagine that the meat fibres we're looking at here are the meat fibres in a steak. Steak comes from a part of the animal that doesn't move very much. So the connective tissue is thin, and a fast method of cooking like frying or stir frying or grilling will change this connective tissue to gelatin very quickly, which is why we can cook our steak very fast. Whereas this meat structure here, these are longer, thicker fibres that come from a part of the animal that moves more. So like the shoulders, the neck, the legs, so much more muscle built up and thicker connective tissue. This is generally on what we would call cheaper cuts of meat. They're equally nutritious, they just take a little bit more skill and a little bit more time to cook. So long, slow, moist cooking like casseroling will very effectively turn this connective tissue into gelatin. And the advantage of casseroling as well is that you're cooking your vegetables with your meat, so your water-soluble vitamins are going into the cooking liquid and you're consuming that rather than throwing it away. So, this brings us on to the what causes meat to be tough and what can we do about it. So, the things that make meat tough are first of all the age of the animal. Older animals, the meat will be tougher. We talked about BSE and the effect that had on the meat industry in Ireland. So now the rule for carcass animals is that they can't be over 2 years old when they're being slaughtered. Generally speaking, older chickens, for example, tend to go into the food industry as opposed to being for sale. The average age of chickens that we would consume in Ireland is 9 months. The activity. So this refers to the part of the body and how much muscle has been built up. Going back over to our diagrams of the meat fibres, have they developed long fibres with a lot of connective tissue, or parts of the animal that don't build up as much muscle will have thinner connective tissue and shorter fibres. Then the method of cooking we choose. So if I go back to my thick connective tissue here, if I cut that meat up and stir fry it, it'll cook, but it'll be like eating the sole of your shoe. It'll be really, really tough. Whereas with the thinner connective tissue, we can cook that by a very fast method like stir frying and it'll be absolutely delicious. The treatment of the animal before slaughter. So, if the animals aren't allowed to rest, if they're not relaxed, the meat will be tougher because they will have no glycogen built up in their muscle. They will have used that in panic. Remember we talked about glycogen being our fight or flight. It's our emergency energy reserve when we're really scared. And it is really, if animals release that before slaughter, their meat will be very tough. And then the treatment after slaughter. Different meats have to be hung for different lengths of time, and what's happening when the meat is being hung is that muscles has to turn into lactic acid, and that lactic acid tenderises the meat as it's hung. So the very minimum, for example, that beef should be hung is for 10 days. The longer it's hung, the better. Obviously it has to be in proper cold conditions. That gives a chance for the glycogen to convert into lactic acid, and the meat is much more likely to be tender. Okay, so these are the factors that affect the toughness of meat. So if we are dealing with tough meat, is there anything we can do to make it more tender because it's cheaper to buy? So absolutely there is. There are a number of things we can carry out. The first one is what's called mechanical breakdown. There are two ways of carrying this out. One is mincing, and the other is with a meat hammer. So if we look at our diagram, our structure of our tough meat, what mincing is actually doing is cutting through the meat fibres. And once they've been cut through by this mechanical action, we can cook them by a fast method of cooking. So, you know, you can make burgers out of your mince and you can cook those burgers on a frying pan and they will be tender. The second one is with the meat hammer, which has ridges on it, and what you're effectively doing is bashing the meat, so you're making it thinner, but you're also breaking down the meat fibres. There's a slight disadvantage to using a meat hammer because it does puncture some of the meat fibres and releases some of the nutrients that are inside the meat fibres. So mincing is a better choice. The second one is long, slow, moist cooking. So this is stewing, which is done on the hob, or it's called casseroling when we do it in the oven. And like I mentioned before, it has the added benefit of consuming the vegetables and the sauce all together, so there's less loss of nutrients. But casseroling does take a long time, and for very tough meat, you're looking at, you know, 3 to 4 hours in the oven. So you need to have time available, or you need to be very organised and do it the night before. Or you can use a slow cooker. These have become very fashionable lately and they're relatively cheap to buy. So you put your ingredients in before you head out for the day. You turn it on, it can take between 6 and 8 hours to cook. And when you come back, your dinner is ready for you. The next process of tenderising the meat is marinating. So if you think about marinating, we tend to do it for Asian dishes. And generally this is a mixture of an acid, flavourings. The flavourings could be spices, they could be garlic, they could be ginger. They could be spices, but in particular it's the acid that's working for us here, because the acid has the ability to begin the breakdown of our tough connective tissue and make it more tender. Marinating tough meat can be done overnight. You can leave it in the fridge overnight. If you're marinating something like chicken, don't leave it as long because the connective tissue is not as thick and you'll actually change the texture of the meat. It can become quite unpleasant. And the last way is using tenderisers. And there are natural tenderisers like the most common one used is called papain, and it's found naturally in pineapples. This has the ability to break down the connective tissue also, but you can also get artificial tenderisers. Most people wouldn't bother with an artificial tenderiser. It comes in powder form, you sprinkle it on the meat and it tenderises it. And I've said to you before, I slightly suspect there are Chinese takeaways that use tenderisers, because you know by the texture of the, you know, if it says fillet beef and it tends to have a kind of a spongy texture, I do suspect that they have used chemical tenderisers in that. Okay, so our next section is looking at how do we process meat, and we do that in a number of different ways. The easiest one to do at home is freezing. So we talked extensively about the temperatures involved and the size of the ice crystals that form and its importance in not losing any of the nutrients. So if you have a fast freeze section in your freezer, that'll go down to minus 25 degrees, that'll form slightly smaller ice crystals. We talked about the bleeding out onto the plate, the fact that there are nutrients in that and that you should try and use it as far as possible. So freezing, like I said, it can be done domestically. The storage temperature of a domestic freezer is minus 25. The fast freeze temperature is, the storage is minus 18. The fast freeze is minus 25. So, what are the effects of freezing on meat? So there's very little loss of nutritive value. you will get, the microorganisms are inactivated, but remember, inactivation is not killed. They become active as soon as the meat is thawed out. We get a little loss of B vitamins again because of their stability. And if we're not careful, we can get freezer burn. And we talked about that when we were doing freezing, so I'm not going to repeat myself going over that again. Okay, so vacuum packing. We can't carry this out at home, but vacuum packing is basically when you buy any type of meat that is in a plastic wrapper that has absolutely no air and it's completely sealed. The advantage of this is that it will keep for 2 to 3 weeks, depending on the type of meat. You must keep it in the fridge. Once you open it, you have to use it like it was fresh. So generally the process involves deboning the meat, removing some fat maybe, and then it's packaged with all the air removed. And if you remember, why does it keep for 2 to 3 weeks? Going back to our methods of preservation and the conditions needed for the growth of microorganisms, almost all of them require oxygen. So removing the oxygen in vacuum packing makes the meat last longer. And like I said, once you open it, you have to use as fresh. So 2 to 3 days. Okay, so drying. Again, you can't do this at home, this is done commercially. Examples of why would you dry meat? Well, you might dry it to add into packet soups and sauces. You know, where there's little bits of meat. Things like pot noodle that has meat in it. Things like beef jerky, biltong. Now, both of these come from hot countries where they would naturally dry the meat out in the open. It would be sun-dried. We don't have that facility here. So how is this done? Well, the meat is heated to very high temperatures. And this removes all of the water, or most of it. And how it can be done, the fluidized drying we talked about before, where it's like on a conveyor belt over a heat source and the liquid evaporates, or accelerated freeze drying we looked at before as well. So accelerated freeze drying means it's frozen and then all the liquid evaporates without going through evaporates into steam without going through the middle liquid stage. Okay, so in this case microorganisms are destroyed by the high temperatures. Most of the vitamin B are lost. The colour, flavour and texture changes. And the last little bit I want to include here is curing. So we use this in the making of ham and bacon. And like I said, ham, bacon, both made from pork, so using pig meat. And this involves soaking in brine, and you'll remember what brine is, salty water. So it's increasing the effects. One of the effects is increasing the salt content. So for anybody wishing to reduce their salt intake, eating these meats is not a good idea. So it's soaked in brine for 5 days, and then it is hung for 10 days. Another effect is it changes colour, so it goes from pale, kind of beigey pink, to a strong pink colour. The salt content increased, like I said. Right, so our next heading is looking at meat products, things made from meat. Okay, so our first meat product are sausages. Sausages traditionally made with pork meat. The UK, they're very fond of beef sausages. The nutritional value of the sausage very much depends on what's added to the meat. In the case of sausages, it's often breadcrumbs. The only way to find out is to read the nutritional information and look at the percentage of meat in the sausage. Sometimes extra fat is added, spices and herbs, and they vary. Gelatine is made by boiling up the bones of the animals and then letting it cool. And we use gelatine as a setting agent. It has no calories, it has no nutritional value. It's also used in jelly sweets and jellies, mousses, cheesecakes, all set using gelatine. Meat extractives, this is the tasty stuff that you get on your roasting tin when you roast a joint, and we use it to make gravy. Commercially, they use those meat juices on the tray when they're cooking meat, and they use it to make beef stock cubes, chicken stock cubes, and so on. And our last two are beef burgers and pate. So beef burgers, if they're 100% meat, absolutely fine. The only way to know, because there's such a variety on the market, is to read the nutritional information, look at the percentage of beef, and look at any other added ingredients like breadcrumbs, fat, and fat. Pate is traditionally made with liver. The French do country pates, which contain meat as well. A lot of pates have added ingredients too, like the burgers and the sausages, a lot of varieties on the market. So we need to read our nutritional information. And looking at the quality of meat in Ireland and who checks the quality of meat. Well, Board Bia, run the quality assurance for beef and lamb. And you will see there's a quality assurance sticker. It's on most Irish meat that you buy. What that reassures the consumer about is that those farms have been audited, they are regularly visited, they look at every aspect from what the animals are feeding, where they're housed, how old they are, where they're slaughtered, and it is completely traceable from farm to fork. And this is under the auspices of the Department of Agriculture and Marine. So all of our Irish meat is very safe. We have very stringent steps. All abattoirs, for example, have to employ a vet. So we can be absolutely quality. If we see the beef and lamb quality assurance symbol sticker under the auspices of Board Bia, and under Board Bia under the auspices of the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine, that our meat is safe and is of really good quality. And that's the end of meat. Make sure you familiarise yourselves with all the headings, in particular the structure. If you are required to draw the diagram, remember your diagrams need to be in pencil. And that's it for today.